Welcome to our very first episode of the Other Side podcast. Tonight I sat down with someone who almost all Melburnians will recognise instantly. For years he was the guy that brought us the weather, part of almost everyone's nightly routine. You'll know him from Channel 10, but these days his work looks very different. I'm sitting down with Mike Larkan, former weatherman turned funeral celebrant. We chat about how that transition happened and what drew him from a career in television into the funeral world, what he learnt along the way about grief, people and meaning. It's a really honest conversation about change, purpose and finding your place on the other side of a very public career. I'm Michael Phoenix and this is The Other Side. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Other Side podcast. I'm Michael Phoenix and I'm here with the one and only Mike Larkan. Mike, thanks for joining us tonight.
No, thank you. And I'm wondering, do I call you Mike or Michael? Because I know Michael's official and my official name is Michael, but is it Michael or Michael always?
Ooh, well, my close friends and family call me Mikey, so how about that?
Mikey.
There you go. No, look, I really appreciate you coming down tonight. You've made the journey all the way out here. Look, Mike and I first met about 4 years ago.
Yep.
In my time as a funeral director at Larkan in Mordialloc. We've worked together on a number of occasions. Many people will obviously recognise you as a weatherman, but you're a lot more than that. And I really would just love to dive into your story and sort of walk through everything. Let's jump into it. If we sort of start right from the beginning, where did you grow up?
Okay, well, wow, going all the way back, I was born and bred in the western suburbs of Sydney. So I grew up in the suburb was Guildford, and I was born at Liverpool Hospital. A little bit after the Beatles, but the Beatles in England are known as the Liverpool Lads. So when I was a little kid, I thought I came from the same place as the Beatles. So I thought that was pretty cool. So I learned to play the guitar. I wasn't any good at the guitar, but I learned to play the guitar and I really enjoyed it. And from a very, very early age, 10 to 12, I started thinking about what I wanted to do the rest of my life, which a lot of kids at that age weren't even thinking about. But I used to daydream, but I always thought there was more to life than what was in my immediate area in Guildford. And with the guitar, I thought, that's going to get me out of there somehow. And I didn't really know how. Until I was about 12, maybe 13, I thought, I'm going to join a band. I'm going to learn the guitar and be, proficient enough to be in a band. And I did. I joined a band when I was 14. And the band was no good. I'll tell you that firstly. And I was terrible. The band was called Freedom. And it was a very, very average band. The others were older than me. And I stayed with the band from the age of 14 to 17. And when I was about 16, we actually gained a contract with a lawn bowls club. So we're pretty average. And we had older people playing lawn bowls, and we'd play on a Friday night, and the other band would play on a Saturday night, and alternate the following weekend, Friday and Saturday. But the other band, a little bit older, were better than us. And they were actually school teachers. And their name was the Cockroaches. And the Cockroaches became the Wiggles and multi-millionaires. So my first claim to fame, if you like, was getting to meet the Wiggles. So that was from 14 to 17. I also decided when I was a young tacker that I wanted to, as well as try and play guitar in a band, work in the media, television, radio, what have you. And at night time when I was doing my homework, instead of listening just to the songs, I listened to the DJs. And I thought, I'm sure I can do that. Talk about music, maybe crack a joke or what have you. So that was my next dream, to become a DJ. At the age of 16, I left school, I was enrolled in a radio television course to become a DJ. And at 18, I became a radio announcer. So that was sort of my next plan, if you like. And then sort of got into the entertainment industry at the age of 18. So from 16, if I may go back a little bit, my first job was as an office boy, which became a copy boy, for the Sydney Sun, so still in Sydney, and my first boss was Darren Hinch. So Darren Hinch was my first boss, and I was 16, he was in his 30s, he was a newspaper editor, and I was there for 2 years, or just on 2 years, as an office boy, copy boy, doing the radio television course at night. Wasn't succeeding getting a job in radio. I got myself an agent, which was an idea, which, because I didn't have a good voice, didn't help me, but I got some work in television. So I got to work as an extra in a whole bunch of TV shows and TV commercials from the age of 16, 17 and 18. And then 18, my first job was at a radio station up in northern New South Wales. I had been applying for jobs in radio as an announcer, couldn't get any jobs, so the next thing was to knock on doors. So from Sydney, I had a map of New South Wales, and all the towns that had radio stations. So I just drove, stayed in a hotel, stayed in a hotel from town to town to town, and eventually a small town called Inverell, just south of the Queensland border, said, we'll give you a go. So I drove back to Sydney, resigned from my job as an office boy with a son, and then went back up to Inverell as a radio announcer. So I was there for about 18 months, not a very good radio announcer. And another dream I had, and I've sort of taken over the story, haven't I, if that's okay?
No, keep it rolling.
If I hadn't succeeded in radio by the time I was 21, so I joined a radio station when I was 18, I'd circumnavigate the globe, because that was something, I'd always loved geography, and I thought that's what I'll do. So I had a job at Inverell, then I moved to a town called Tamworth, and I really wasn't succeeding, so it was time to go. So then I packed up and spent 2 years backpacking around the world. So I spent around 80 months in Europe and about 6 months in the States, and it was fabulous. And I had to work, of course, because I didn't have a lot of money. So I worked at a pub in London for a couple of months pouring beer, and from that I made enough money to then do a contiguous tour of Russia, Scandinavia. Then I got a job at Woolworths, and from there I gained enough money to then do a month touring around Ireland. So it was just chopping and changing. And I'd always wanted to, actually there were 3 jobs I always wanted to do whilst I was travelling. One was to pour beer at a pub in London, so I did that. I wanted to pick grapes in France, so I went to France to do that. Wrong time of the year, so I continued to Greece, picked olives, same but different. And the third thing I wanted to do, because I had a little bit of experience, was to work on a Hollywood movie. I was in Israel at Christmas, because something else, I also wanted to have Christmas at Bethlehem one year, so I did that. I was 22 now. And Hollywood were in Israel making a Hollywood movie. So I knocked on a few doors, and I had a card from Australia, which was my union card, Actors and Announcers Equity, and it suggested I was an actor from Australia. Cut a long story short, I did get a job on a Hollywood movie for 6 weeks as a stand-in. And the other reason I wanted to work on that movie specifically was because I was 22 and I was in love with the girl who was the star of the movie. And I sort of had watched on the silver screen for a couple of years, and her name was Brooke Shields. So I got to work with and meet Brooke Shields. So that was that. A couple of years travelling around Europe. Had a great time. Had a month in Morocco, a month in Spain and all that sort of thing. Month in Egypt. And then it was time to come home with no money. And then I was about 24. So I knocked on doors and got a job in Canberra. In radio, doing Midnight to Dawn, and then some voiceovers, Tonight's program, brought to you by, that sort of thing. And then did a cadetship, became a journalist in Canberra. Then I was a late night newsreader in Canberra, and I was doing more radio. And that was sort of that. And I was there for nearly 10 years. And then I became the weather presenter with the weekend news on Channel 7 in Canberra. And I was doing weather on location. The boss from Channel 10, Melbourne, was on holidays up in New South Wales, a skiing holiday, and I was doing the weather on location, cracking jokes and what have you. He rang me and said, our weather guys in Melbourne, all very serious, wearing ties and jackets in the studio with a pointer. You're outside having fun. Would you be interested in a move to Melbourne, sort of a point of difference? So I said, yep. So then I moved to Melbourne, and that was in 1996. And for 25 years, I was the Melbourne weatherman, and I loved it. I was on location, I was cracking jokes, I was meeting celebrities, I was red carpeting. In summer, I'd do the weather from a beach. In winter, from a fireplace. No fireplace working tonight because it's too hot. And all that sort of thing, which was fabulous. And also working in radio and television, you get asked to host events. And I've always hosted events and enjoyed conferences, seminars, award nights, emceeing weddings. I emceed a big wedding about 2000 or something. And during the night, 3 couples said, look, we know you from the telly, didn't know you emceed weddings, could you MC ours? I thought, sure. And I thought, I haven't been to a wedding ceremony for quite a while. I might go to a couple of ceremonies to do a bit of homework. So I went to a couple of wedding ceremonies, and I found the celebrants were a little different to what I would do as a wedding celebrant. I'd make it a bit more interesting and a few different things. So I looked into it. I enrolled in the International College of Celebrancy, like a high failure rate, certificate 4, quite difficult, did that, and then became a wedding celebrant. Enjoyed it more than I thought. Initially, I thought if I officiate a wedding once a month for a bit of fun, a bit of extra money, that'd be great. I enjoyed meeting couples more than I thought, and I enjoyed officiating weddings more than I thought. So I well, I started doing a lot more weddings than I thought, started knocking back lots of weddings, and I thought, you know what, when my television career finishes one day, I might just do weddings. COVID happened, and by that stage I was officiating 1 or 2 weddings a week and knocking back a good number, and I thought, you know what, I can sort of move from one to the other. So the whole thing with COVID happened, so that was that. And when you're a wedding celebrant, once a year you have to do an ongoing professional development course. And there's about 10 units, and some are optional, some you have to do. And 2 of the units, 9 and 10, were a couple that I always looked at but really didn't do anything about it. But when COVID happened, I thought, you know, I'm going to look into it. And one unit was writing a funeral, and another was officiating a funeral. So I thought, you know what, I might look into that as well. So the next year for the ongoing professional development, I did those 2 units. And I found it quite interesting and quite challenging, because with weddings you meet couples who are getting married, it's very happy and what have you. Obviously with funeral services, it's about grieving, it's about a family who's upset and trying to do the right thing by them. So I thought next time, and I'd already been asked if I officiated funerals a number of times, and I've always said no. But I thought next time I get asked by a funeral director, often a guest at a wedding, who would say, you do funerals? I've always said no. I thought next time I'll say yes, but it's got to be an older person, not a tragic death, and not use the word funeral, but celebration of life. And then a funeral director at a wedding approached me and said, oh, you do funerals? And I said, look, I don't, but that's my criteria, if you like, because I don't know how I go with the grieving process. And so this funeral director, he said, look, I'm a one-man band. If you want to, we'll do one and see how you go. So I officiated 1 service, and I found it a lot more rewarding than I thought I would. I was the conduit between the family, the funeral director, and it felt very special afterwards, and I was quite surprised. And the funeral director said, so how did you go? And I said, well, I think I went okay, and I think the mourners, who I like to call guests, enjoyed the service that I put together. And as we were chatting at the end of the service, a couple of mourners came out and said, oh, I'll grab your card. Now, I didn't have a business card, of course, but he said, there you go. So that was the first of the journey. So that was about 5 years ago, I guess. And slowly but surely, I started officiating more services. And enjoyment is not quite the word. Rewarding, again, is the word. And doing the right thing by a family. And I think because I'm a journalist by trade and a presenter by trade, they were 2 areas that I was able to focus on and hopefully shine a light on what I could do for a family. Now, when a family does meet up with a funeral director, funeral arranger, there's a couple of decisions to be made. Whether it's that coffin, whether it's that casket, whether it's those flowers, whether after the service there's a cremation, a burial, whether there's a wake, refreshments, what have you, and also a celebrant. Now, is it going to be a male celebrant, a female celebrant, an older celebrant, somebody who is focused on religion, what have you? So I sort of became a celebrant, if you like, that a number of funeral directors or funeral homes would suggest if you want something not too heavy and a mature male with a bit of experience, Mike might be the go. So that's sort of my journey, if you like, to becoming a funeral celebrant, if that's not too long a story.
That's amazing. There's so much to unpack there. I mean, I still can't get over the cockroaches. My mind is still stuck there. The cockroaches, the Wiggles.
I know.
You've got Darren Hinch, you've got Brooke Shields, there's the travelling around Europe. There's so many different, points along the journey. It's a fascinating journey you've had, and of course working in media, which is a big part of your life. I definitely do want to dig a little bit more into the funeral side of things.
Yes.
But before we go there, I do want to chat about your time in media. I'm sure a lot of people watching this would recognise you from there, and I would. I'll kick myself if I don't ask a few questions about that.
Go for it.
Stage of your life. But so you sort of mentioned how you came to work for Channel 10 and be the weatherman. But
Yes.
what was that like, just on a sort of day-to-day, week-to-week basis? What did your life look like during that time?
Fantastic, because I was also the producer of that segment, and what that meant, it was up to me to find a location for the weather. So when it was warm, the beach is obvious. When it was cold, a fireplace was obvious. But then I started exploring other areas, and I'm a Bomber supporter, so I thought, you know what, I should do the weather with the coach of the Bombers. So I did that. And then on another occasion, the captain of the Bombers, if you like, Dyson Heppel. So I was able to do that. And then I started doing the weather from the footy from the MCG. And over a period of time, I got to know people behind the scenes that were involved in marketing or advertising or PR. So then I was able to, okay, the Brownlow's a pretty big night. I want to do the weather from the Brownlow. So I started doing the weather from the Brownlow. But you know what? I actually want to hold the Brownlow medal. So I just made calls and whatever, and those sorts of things occurred. And before doing the weather, now just keeping in mind, before I came here, doing the weather for 25 years, the weather in the evening, as I mentioned before, was like your Rob Gell, David Brown, Edward Marr, who effectively were men with suits and ties and a pointer. I was outside on location. So I took it to the next degree. As I said, it was an opening night. If it was a food and wine festival, a fashion festival, I was there. And it gave a good lot of free publicity to that event as well, but also charities. So I started officiating a lot of things with charities. I'm an Australia Day ambassador, so I pushed that through the weather. I've been a Variety Club ambassador for about 30 years, so I pushed that. And the Salvos, the Smith family, Christmas appeals. So it all worked really well. So I was able to give publicity, free publicity to all this. So it worked out very, very nicely. And because I was in charge of my segment, effectively the boss was happy as long as I filled it somehow and made it sort of half interesting. So I try to make the weather interesting and informative. And by making it interesting, rather than talk about upper level disturbances or stratocumulus clouds, I was at an event and I talk about the weather in the sense that you wear a short sleeve shirt tomorrow or take an umbrella. And in the weather segment, I also knew that people weren't sitting home watching the weather. They might be getting dinner ready or the kids or whatever. So I'd repeat the weather for the following day or the following couple of days during my segment a couple of times in different ways so people would actually hear it. So that worked well. And so successfully, in fact, that the weather presenters on the other stations were then asked by their bosses to start getting outside and doing what Larkan does and promote events and that. And they didn't like doing it as much as I did. And also, because I had many years in radio, I was used to ad-libbing. And I didn't actually, which a lot of people don't realise, I didn't use auto cue. So on location, I'd memorise it. Really? So once I was off camera, I was able to take my notes. But when I was there by myself, doing a school visit, every Friday I used to show a dog from the Lost Dogs Home. It was all ad-lib. It was all memorised. So it was a nice skill to have, if you like, and I enjoyed it. And it worked well. And if I wanted to meet somebody, I would just sort of talk to the PR person, the marketing person or whatever, and eventually do a weather cross with them just because I wanted to meet them. And it was, it was a little bit of fun. For a little while, I had a thing I called Celebrity Weather. The boss wasn't overly happy with it because it was focusing too much on another person as against the weather, but I did it for a little while. And then something else I came up with, and it worked really, really well. I noticed that every now and then a viewer would send a weather photo to the news, and sometimes the weather presenter might put it up or what have you. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to run with that. So I called it Mike's Picks, had a website, and I got viewers to send me weather photos. And rather than have it in the background, I'd have it full screen and said, got a photo from Michael Phoenix of Morty Alec or blah, 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 and made that person the star. So I was inundated with weather photos. So every night I'd show 2, sometimes 3 photos a night, and it was fabulous. So you had viewers, a lot of kids, a lot of older people would send photos in and they'd be full screen on television. And then during Christmas periods, I'd start instead show kids dressed up in their Christmas outfits or lights out front of houses. So it became very, very popular as well. And I think the other TV stations sort of followed it a little bit, but not to the same degree. And it just worked well. And the weather segment can be a popular part of the news. And my segment was reasonably popular, but also in default because my weather segment was on just before the Seinfeld shows, so just before Seinfeld or The Simpsons. So there were a lot of people who wanted to watch the beginning of Seinfeld or The Simpsons, and they put the telly on to record just before their program, so they wouldn't miss the beginning of it. And by accident, they come across the weather. So there was a good audience I got by default. And also, I started cracking a joke, at least one, mostly dad jokes, every night. And then there was a following of people who would watch it just to watch the joke. And then some of the radio stations would replay the joke the next day. So there was that popularity, if you like. And it was just a lot of fun. So effectively, I was in charge of pretty much what I wanted to do. And I've got to say, if I was going to I don't know, if I was going to the city to meet some friends, I would do the weather from the city. If I was having friends over to my house for a barbecue, I would happen to be doing the weather close to home as well. So there was that, but no viewer knew that, and nothing was ever sacrificed. So, and then I've got to say also, there were the serious side of things. Black Saturday, a number of years ago, which became very, very serious in the week leading up to it. I was doing the weather crosses from the CFA, etc. And we were talking about how bad the weather was getting and how scary that Saturday was going to be. So that became very serious. And of course, nearly 200 people died, and that was tragic. And I presented the weather on a more serious note the following couple of weeks up there, Whittlesea and Kings Lake, etc. So so when it was time to be serious, I was. And when there was floods, I was I was crossing from Shepparton and the likes of that, and we're choppering in and doing the weather and things like that. So when it had to be serious, it was serious. When it was okay to be lighthearted, it was lighthearted.
You sort of spoke a little bit earlier about how you ended up in that position, and you went from music to working with Darren Hinch, and then all these sorts of things. It sounds like you really carved out a niche in the sort of weather space, and you took something that was a little bit stiff, for lack of a better term. You really made it your own, and were a bit of a pioneer in the sense. But was there any specific interest in weather or something that drew you, or was it just an opportunity that arose and you thought, I'm going to have a real crack at this?
Well, a little bit of both. So I mentioned before that I started as a radio announcer up in country New South Wales. Now, being a city person, all you want is sunshine. And you say, what a great day, sunny and 25 degrees. And you think, how good's that? When I went up to the country, it was a lovely sunny day, and I said the same thing. And my boss said, just be very careful. There are farmers who don't want sunshine. They want rain. And I go, oh, okay. So I was a bit conscious of that. And in the city, you might get a wind warning of sorts. In rural country areas, there are all sorts of other warnings you get. And one of them was a sheep grazers alert. And I thought, what is a sheep grazers alert? So I was curious about it. And then I started getting an interest in the actual weather. And I thought, there was on the TV, there were all these squiggly lines. There was an H and an L. And there was also in the newspaper. I thought, what the heck is that? So I started doing a little research. This is before you could Google things. And then I remember I rang the Weather Bureau, and I went in there, just popped in there to say hello, and they sort of taught me a little bit about things and what have you. And when I was in Tamworth, I was doing segments on a Monday night, helping young school leavers decide on a future, and I was called applicable positions to apply for, because it was a bit of a tongue twister. And I talked to a person in a different vocation, and one of them was a guy from the Weather Bureau, and I sort of found it interesting. So that was that part of it. When I moved to Canberra as a journalist, and I was a producer behind the scenes, and then for a little while I had to write the weather for the weather presenter. So I was interested, and I wanted to learn a bit about what I was writing about. So then I started going to the Weather Bureau on a semi-regular basis when I became the presenter as well, or backup presenter, just so I knew what I was talking about, because also I wanted to be able to talk about what have you without having to refer to notes. So I learned how to read the charts, those H and the L's, the highs and the lows, and which way the winds were blowing, and anticyclonic gloom, what that was, and how you can sort of work on what temperature should be. So before long, I was able to not be an official meteorologist, but as a journalist, if you like, and with a person with interest, I was able to look at a chart and I was able to work out which winds were going clockwise, anti-clockwise, and get a bit of an idea of how the weather should be happening. Interesting. So you look at the weather chart, you look at what temperatures and weather situations have been in the past, you sort of put the mix in there and what have you. And you've got cold fronts and warm fronts and things like that. And I found out, after asking the experts, why is the weather wrong sometimes? And they said, well, generally it's one thing and it goes two ways. I said, well, what do you mean? It's the wind. And I said, right. And when the weather forecast is wrong, it's generally to do with the wind. The wind can change direction or it can change speed. So there can be a rain cloud, and this is as basic as I want to be, if you like, a rain cloud over South Australia. If the wind's blowing it across, you sort of work out time-wise that rain cloud gets over Victoria tomorrow, so it should rain. Okay, so that's the real basics. But if the wind gets a bit faster, that rain cloud gets faster, so instead of raining tomorrow, it might rain tonight. But then if it changed the direction, that rain cloud might go over New South Wales, not over Victoria, so the rain doesn't happen. Now that's the real basics, if you like. But I found that quite interesting. So then I started going, when I became the weatherman in Canberra, I started going to the Weather Bureau every day, and I'd learn about the charts and we'd have a bit of a discussion and what have you. So that was the interest. So then when I was offered the role at Channel 10 in Melbourne, I was totally au fait with how the weather systems work. Not an expert by any means, but at the end of the day, the Weather Bureau gives out the same information, radio, television, newspaper, online. It's then how the person presents that weather, whether they want to be very official and very serious about it and worry about credibility, or want to engage the audience and have no credibility and be incredible. No, I'm not sure what that means. So I had an interest and understand it to a degree.
In total, sort of how long was your career in TV?
Wow, okay. 25, 35, 40 years, 40 years, I guess. Because, I mean, when you say TV, I mean, my first job was sort of interesting. I got an agent when I was 16, and when you get an agent, you fill out what you can do and what you can't do, but you fill out what you can do, and you say, can do this, can do this, can do this, can do this, and then, you just hope. And the first occasion, the first two things I did was sort of interesting, and I was 16, can you dance? And back then it was disco, right? So it's the late 70s, early 80s. So I said, yeah, of course, whatever. So it was at Channel 7 at Epping in Sydney, and it was a dance scene. So they partnered everybody off, and I was paired off with a girl, and we're dancing away, and the cameras, going through the dancing, everyone dancing, whatever. But there was a girl and her partner, and they kept pushing in, trying to get in front of the camera. I thought, God, so dancing away and whatever. I thought, how's this girl and this guy just pushing to make sure the camera's on them or whatever? Didn't realise, and we weren't told on purpose by the director, the girl was playing a blind girl, and they were after natural reactions from everybody else. So she wasn't following the camera was actually following her. That was my very first, so that was a bit awkward. So that was funny, and that was a TV show called Glenview High. And I did 13 episodes of Glenview High, mostly as an extra, so just one of about 20 kids. A lot of fun, real lot of fun. Actually, I met Ken James, who years later I met through the Bert Newton show. And he was a big star back then because he'd been on a show called The Box, and he was now doing Glenview High as a school teacher. So that was that. And so I did about 13 episodes of that. Had a couple of very, very, very minor speaking roles, but I had a lot of fun. And Glenview High was replaced by The Restless Years. Then I did a few things called the Young Doctors, all these shows you would never heard of, but that was back in that era. But then my first TV commercial was sort of interesting, and it was for, who was it for? I'm going to say Burley Bras, but it wasn't Burley, it was another brand, I think. But again, I can play tennis, right? So the scene was, it was the first female sports bra to be advertised on television. And there was one scene, and the scene was me hitting a ball over the net to a player who would then hit it to my partner, who hit it to the last girl, and she would actually run forward to hit the ball, and you could see the support. Fantastic. All four of us couldn't play tennis. So it was one scene, the camera zooming into the girl who was the last. So if I got the serve right, great. If that person got the hit back right, so it was that. So what was a 1 hour shoot took a full day for one scene. But no, so that was that. Just, a bit of fun.
I can only imagine when you talk about a 40-odd year career that some of the experiences you must have had are just unbelievable. Are there any that come to mind where just sort of a crazy story where you go, looking back, I can't even believe that I did that? Is there any real standouts?
The Johnny, I grew up, when I was about 8, 10 or whatever, the Johnny Carson show, and you may or may not have heard of Johnny Carson, but he was a huge television personality in America, and he'd get the big stars on. And I used to watch Johnny Carson and go, oh my gosh, how good is that? And then our Australian version was Bert Newton, and Bert Newton was a sidekick to Don Lane and Graham Kennedy. And as I got a bit older, Bert Newton had Celebrant on his show and what have you. Anyway, the only reason I mention that is when I was in America, the Johnny Carson show was live in Los Angeles, so I thought I have to go to the Johnny Carson show. So I did, just not as a guest, just as sitting in the crowd and whatever. So I was in the audience. So over the years, there were three people. There was Johnny Carson, there was Bert Newton, and there was David Letterman. So over the years, I was able to, be in all those shows. But when I got to meet Bert when I first moved to Melbourne, he was my idol. And I thought, how good is this? And I became friends with Bert, which was just lovely indeed. And unfortunately, I went to his funeral. So I guess you get to meet a lot of people when you're in the media. And I wanted to meet Kylie Minogue, so I actually met Kylie through her brother, who was a cameraman at Channel 9. I wanted to meet Jimmy Barnes many years ago, so I did a weather cross with Jimmy. So all those, and people I'd grown up with watching on television or listening to their music, whether it was Skyhooks, Sherbet, became friends with Darryl Braithwaite, all those, which are fantastic things over the years. But I remember when I was in Canberra, there was the Canberra Raiders rugby league team, and they were the number one team, so I wanted to meet them. So I got to meet Bradley Clyde and Ricky Stewart and Laurie Davey, Mal Meninga, who were all big names in the world of rugby league, and became friends with them, which is fantastic. Craig Bellamy, who's now the coach of the Melbourne Storm, so I got to meet all of them. Laurie Daly, who's the coach of the New South Wales rugby league team, which is a lot of fun. But there was one person I wanted to meet when I was in Canberra, and that was the Prime Minister. And I put in a couple of requests to do a weather with him. To do a news cross with him back then, but they weren't interested. Eventually, I got to the lodge and did a weather cross with him, which was fantastic, a lot of fun and that. But just before that, the Canberra Casino was opening, and they had a huge opening night where it was like a who's who at the zoo, all the politicians there got to be invited. And then I was able to go behind the scenes with the Prime Minister and playing blackjack and poker and all that stuff, which was sensational indeed. So I guess that was fun.
Are you allowed to tell me which Prime Minister it was?
It was Bob Hawke.
Ah.
Yeah. So So remember any bum who sacks the person, whatever. Another story. I remember in the late 90s, I was hosting a charity event at Crown. And the musician for that event that night was Russell Morris, and he'd had a lot of hits in the late 60s, early 70s, and his friend was a manager called Michael Gudinski. And I was introduced to Michael during the night, and Michael said to Russell, look, I've got to catch up with another friend of mine later in the night. If when you finish the show you want to join us and have a drink or two, and I said, sure. And I just met Michael Gudinski, and Michael said, of course, to me, Mike, if you want to come along, you're more than welcome to. So I was doing nothing really. I was host of the event, and Russell and I finished the event, Russell Morris and I. We had a couple of beers, I think it was, waiting for Gudinski. He turned up. He said, oh, sorry about that. He said, we'll go meet my mate now. So I said, sure. So we went down to, I think it was called Fidel's, which was a cigar bar at Crown, and there was only 8 of us in a private room. There was the few I spoke about, plus a couple of Michael Gudinski's friends. And then his actual friend turned up, and it was Tom Jones.
Oh, wow.
So we started having karaoke and having a few drinks, a few cigars, and for the next couple of hours we were singing Tom Jones songs, with Tom Jones. That was pretty cool. I got home very late that night, and that was before I had a mobile phone, unfortunately, so I was in trouble from my wife, but I thought I was pretty funny to say. But it's not unusual.
Being a household name, I could only imagine, even now, after years have gone by, I would imagine if you and I were walking anywhere in public, whether it be through Chadstone or down the main street of Brighton or anywhere in Melbourne, there would be people that would not only recognise you but stop and chat to you and ask for photos and all of that. What's that like?
It doesn't happen so much now. It used to happen a lot, but when I officiate weddings or even services, people have a chat. Sometimes people want a photo, or quite regularly want photos and what have you. Look, it's a nice feeling. I guess it's healthy for the ego, I guess, but it also helps me get some work, I guess, as a host, as a celebrant, whether it's weddings or funerals or what have you. It's a bit of a buzz. And when I'm with other friends who aren't in the industry, it's like, wow, you find that weird? And I said, well, it's always sort of been there, I guess, but I'm not a big star by any means, and I don't pretend that at all. But people do point or whisper and what have you, and it's funny when I officiate funerals or weddings, they sort of recognise my face or wearing a suit up the front there, and then when I turn the microphone on, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon, and they go, I told you it was him, and whatever, so yeah, it's a little bit of fun.
It must be interesting though, people that have watched you over the years, and they have an idea or a sense that they know who you are, but you have no idea who
Correct,
they are.
yeah.
It must be an odd feeling.
Yeah, but you don't want to embarrass anybody. And I remember, and because I get people all the time, always they say, how's the weather? Now, I hear it all the time. And if I'm at a service, but especially if I'm at a wedding, I might hear it 5-10 times. But I remember, well before I sort of got known, if you like, Paul Hogan was the star of Crocodile Dundee. And one of his famous lines was, "That's not a knife, that's a knife." And I remember seeing a reporter say to him, "So, like, do you ever get like sick of like people saying, 'Oh, that's not a knife'?" He said, "No, because that's their first time they've said it." And I thought, that's good. And then, so when I started doing the weather, whatever, that's the way you got to look at it. That's the first time they've said it, And people will say it like in front of their mates, and they're taking the mickey out of you and things like that. But but it's funny at Channel 10 in South Yarra. Channel 10 is on floors 4, 5, and 6, and you catch the lift with general public or whatever, and someone might say, "Gosh, how's the weather? What's it like outside?" Or "How hot is it?" Now, I don't know if they're making small talk or they're actually asking how the weather is. So, and I still get people all the time asking about the weather. So I'm familiar with it all the time. And people, "I'm off to Sydney. What's it like up there? What's it like over in Bali at the moment?" So I'm aware of the weather anyway. And I've had the interest for like 30 years. Or more than 30 years now. So I do keep an eye on it. I still look at the weather charts, and I don't watch the weather on telly as much with the weather presenters. In fact, I don't watch much free-to-air television at all.
It sounds like you handle it with grace, although I'm sure there are times where you're sort of thinking this is wearing a bit thin, but
No, you know what? No, that's such a minor thing, such a minor thing to worry about.
Yeah.
I tell you what's funny also, if I may say, is older people, when they recognise me from the telly, but they don't know it's from the telly, but they know me, and it's quite a personable sort of feeling, and they've seen me in their lounge room or in their kitchen, but not realising on the telly. So some older people think that I must be a friend of their grandchildren.
Yeah. So you've had a long and successful career in television. When did things sort of start to shift from being the weatherman to moving into more celebrancy? Was there a bit of overlap there?
Oh, yeah. I've been I was officiating weddings for 7 years whilst I was still doing the weather on Channel 10. So, yeah. So I think I mentioned before, well, if I haven't already, I was emceeing a wedding, and from that it became a wedding celebrant after doing a bit of homework, what have you. So my actual first ever wedding was on radio. I went to lunch with, there was a table of radio TV people with Mick Malloy, who's a stand-up comic. And at the time, Mick was doing the breakfast show on Triple M with Eddie Maguire. Anyway, so we're having lunch. It was a Melbourne Cup luncheon. And we're just talking about what we're doing and what have you. And I said, "I'm becoming a wedding celebrant." He goes, "Oh." Mick says, "When's your first wedding?" I said, "Well, I don't have one." He goes, "So how's that work?" I said, "Well, I'm going to promote it or what have you." And he said, "So you got no weddings?" I said, "No." He said, "Maybe we should do the first wedding on the radio." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Why don't we have a competition, and the winners, a couple, they get a wedding and you be the celebrant or something?" I said, "Okay." He said, "Let's have a think about it." So we met up with the producer of the Triple M breakfast show, Big J, the following day, and they came up with the idea of Mick Malloy's shotgun wedding, celebrity celebrant Mike Larkan, celebrity MC Eddie Maguire, ring bearer Darren Hinch. And it was a huge success, got a lot of publicity, obviously on Triple M and their website, plus also the Herald Sun. As a result of that, I got a lot of free publicity to do weddings. So that's sort of how the wedding thing happened. But I still did the weather. So I was doing the weather Monday to Friday, weddings pretty much every Saturday night. And I was still emceeing a few weddings on Saturday nights. And I was knocking back a lot of work weekdays, especially on Fridays. So I knew that if and when television ever finished, there'd be a number of weddings if I wanted to do that. So I did that. So with weddings, bookings can be 3 months, 6 months, 12 months in advance. At the moment, I've got weddings booked for 2028, which is like 2 years away, and love it. So primarily it's Friday, Saturdays and Sundays. Although this week I'm officiating weddings Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and I'm an MC Thursday, Saturday and Sunday as well. So quite busy. So that happened. Then COVID occurred, everything changed and what have you. And television finished. I finished on there was nobody watching, so it didn't matter. And then I finished doing the weather, and then I went back a few months later, did some segments called Mike's Melbourne. Morale was bad, there was no viewers. So I just moved into the wedding industry full time, if you like. Almost. The other thing I always wanted to do was become an auctioneer. To become an auctioneer, you have to have your real estate license. And when I was at Channel 10 under my contract, I couldn't work for another company. As against being a wedding celebrant, you're self-employed. As an agent, you're working for a company. So when the television finished, I thought, beauty, I'll try real estate. So I enrolled in the REIV real estate course, so I did that. And then I joined McGrath Real Estate in Sandringham because the winners of the block, their place was sold by McGrath Sandringham, so there's a television connection. So I joined McGrath and they were fabulous. And that was actually during COVID, but they were fabulous. But the idea was to become an auctioneer. But the auctioneer trainer was in Sydney, and because of curfew, you couldn't come down to Sydney. So there was things that didn't quite work out. So I left McGrath and I joined an auctioneering company. But again, it was still during COVID, so the auctions were few and far between. So I think I did about 20 auctions, and I enjoyed it. But it was a bad time for the industry. Nobody was selling because of COVID, and you couldn't have open house inspections, all that sort of thing. And then as we sort of got out of COVID, weddings picked up again. So I just jumped on the bandwagon doing weddings. And there were a lot of couples that said, look, when COVID finishes, we want you to marry us and what have you. I'd met couples, had the paperwork done. So that was, I did a lot of small weddings, home or backyard weddings, things like that. And then sort of moved into funerals as well as weddings as well. So I'm a full-time celebrant, weddings and funerals.
Yeah. I do want to talk a little bit more about the funeral celebrancy. Remind me again, what were the sort of few points that you had when you were talking about when you had your very first funeral service?
Yeah.
You mentioned there were 3 or 4 things. What were they? Can you remind me?
So because I was new to it and I wasn't sure how I'd go with the grieving process, and this is the weird thing, I'd only been to one funeral my whole life. I had this, not fear, but a desire not to go to funerals. And also, I was often working, so I couldn't go. And because my family was from Sydney, I was now living in Canberra, then Melbourne. I sort of wasn't close to home. Anyway, so the deal was I had to be an older person who'd lived a great life, not attracted to death, and not use the word funeral, but celebration of life. I've since expanded, but also initially I didn't want to do a burial because I wasn't comfortable about that. And I sort of moved into that process. And then once I found the importance of getting it right for the family, I then felt that I did want to expand and then move into an area where I was able to help families in a grieving process. And I got into some books and went online doing a little bit of study myself as well, that I felt I could be the right fit if the person had passed away, if they weren't an older person, hadn't had a great life, and it was a tragic death. I felt that I could be the good go-between. And I've officiated services where people have died in car accidents, there have been suicides, and I've been able to help families with the process of controlling the narrative, if you like, when they weren't sure how to go about it. So I've been able to do that. I still won't do a child service. One of the harder services I did officiate was for a young girl in her 30s, and I was her wedding celebrant. But also, I'd actually been to her school, visiting her school with the news. I did a weather cross from there. And then when she was about to get married and found out I was her wedding celebrant, she contacted me. I was unavailable, and so she changed the date so I could be available for her wedding. When she passed away, her father rang me and said, look, she would like it if you would be her celebrant in the days leading up to her passing away. And I remembered her favourite colour was pink, so I said, let's start with a pink coffin, and my first words will be pretty in pink, and let's ask mourners to wear something pink. So I had a really bright pink tie, as it turned out, and that was probably the hardest because her husband, who I'd obviously, who I'd married with the one, was there with little kids, so that was very, very difficult. And then during the photo tribute, one of the highlights of her life was her wedding day. And I was in a number of those photos, so that was probably the hardest. I don't want to have to do that again.
That must have been very challenging, to say the least.
It was, because there were a number. Because the last time I saw her was, I think it was like 5 years prior. I can't remember exactly when I officiated their wedding. It was obviously a celebration, and there's a good number of people who were at that wedding who were also at the service 5 years later. So I'd gone from happy, having a great time, to the very challenging experience of that day. So yeah.
It must be challenging to, to flick between these two modes, especially in any given week. You might be doing a couple of weddings and a couple of funerals, perhaps. How do you go with that changing hats, so to speak?
Well, that's right. And it's not unusual that I officiate a service in the morning on a Friday and then a fun wedding that Friday afternoon. So it's, don't want to get my files confused. Most of my services are uplifting and still very positive. But I know with the family, it's very different, obviously, with the service than a wedding where it's all fun and what have you, and it's been planned forever. And the service is usually something that hasn't been planned for too long, unless it's an older person where they know it's going to happen. And keeping in mind, it's not about me by any means. It's about the person who's passed away. It's about the couple getting married, but it's doing right in both scenarios, and helping, and being the help that hopefully has most of the answers.
You just mentioned it then, that it's not about you. I could only imagine that there would be some funeral directors in particular, maybe not so much on the wedding side, but some funeral directors that might go, you know what, Mike's got the technical skills and everything that make a great celebrant, but they may be hesitant because they're not wanting it to be about you, knowing that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
What do you make of that?
Well, I don't really hear about that until afterwards. And that has happened a couple of times with Invocare, where they've said, Celebrant, we suggest is Mike, blah, blah, blah. And they go, we've seen him on the telly, cracks a lot of jokes, a lot of fun. We want something a bit more serious, or we want a religious element. So they won't even look past that. And that's fine, because it's about the person who's passed away, and you want to get it right in all the different areas, including the celebrant. So you definitely want the right fit. And a good funeral arranger, a good funeral director will have a number of celebrants, and they should, from the conversation, say, yes, the ideal person would be this person or these couple of people. So if it's a person who's quite serious and what have you, there's possibly another celebrant who can do a better job than me for that family.
Yeah, well said. Now, working in the funeral industry, regardless of the role, it's generally not something that most people grow up, thinking, I want to be a funeral celebrant or a funeral director. But, I know myself personally, it's been one of the most fulfilling and rewarding industries.
Fulfilling and rewarding
I've
are
ever had.
two key words as a celebrant as well.
Yeah, are there any sort of, life lessons or different perspectives that you've gained through working in this industry?
Yeah, life's short. That's one thing. And also what I have found, which I think surprised me, broken families. So, yes. And you would know that as well. When you meet up with families, there are step-parents, step-children and what have you. There are brothers and sisters who haven't spoken for 5 years. There's the son who wants to do things this way, and his estranged sister doesn't do it wants to do it this way, or not to mention this person or that person. So that's quite interesting. And also when you meet up with a family, and there might be, say, 5 siblings, all 5 have different ways of how they want to approach the service. They want this music, or they want this reading, or what have you. So how it works with myself, when I've been asked by a funeral home to officiate a service, I contact the family and I explain the process, which they may or may not know to a degree, and then I suggest that we meet up in the next couple of days. But in the meantime, what I'd like to do is send an email, and with the email some attachments, and this will make our meeting a little smoother, and also it'll help you. So one attachment is an example of an order of service. So a bit of a rundown for the day, whether we start with a reading, whether we start with a hymn, the opening music, who's going to be speaking, the eulogies, are there tributes, is there a video tribute, are there grandchildren speaking, all those sorts of things. So there's an idea of a popular order of service. Another attachment I send are some ideas of some songs, another some ideas of readings, and another a bit of a questionnaire with a timeline. And I suggest that the family has a look at it, but if they don't, doesn't matter. Do they have to make decisions before our meeting? The answer is no. So then I have the meeting with the family. Now, more often than not, that person either hasn't looked at any of the information I've sent, or they haven't shared it with everybody else. And while this person wants to hear Frank Sinatra my way, because Dad was like that, another sibling goes, no, he liked Split Ends. So you try and work the conversation with everybody, I guess, and get everybody involved and whatever. And I try and make sure the meeting's about an hour, hour and a half maximum. and don't get bogged down with what song we're going to decide on or what reading we're going to decide on. So from the information supplied, I then put together an order of service, email it to the family and ask everyone to have a look at it, and then email back any changes in red just so I don't miss them. And then we've got something to work from. I can then pass that back to the funeral director, the funeral home, and that can then go to the printer. And the second part is the content that goes into the ceremony script. So I write that and again ask any changes in red. So there might be a lot of chopping and changing, but the family have always seen the ceremony script in its entirety well before the service.
I only just learned recently that, within the last year or so, you've also faced some of your own health battles.
Yeah.
Is that something you'd be comfortable sharing, what the journey's been like for you?
Certainly. So at the beginning of last year, I was having a shave, found a lump there, went to the doctor, and they said, we'll put you onto an ear, nose and throat specialist. So I had a test, scan, and they found I had cancer in my tonsil. So the specialist said 3 words, curable tonsil cancer. So I had the tonsils removed, and then they found more cancer. So I rang my parents to tell them, and on the same day that I was actually diagnosed with cancer, my mum said, your father just passed away, I was about to call you. So the same day I was diagnosed with cancer, my dad died. So that was pretty hard. So with that in mind also, I was to get my tonsils removed the following Friday week, because that was the day that the surgeon worked. And I said, well, can I postpone? He said, why is that? I said, my father's passed away, I'd like to go to his service. He lives up at northern New South Wales, so I went up for that. So I came back, the tonsils were removed, cancer was found, and it was a horrific journey of throat cancer and having chemotherapy, having radiation for the next number of months. A friend of mine had breast cancer, and she was telling me how she had 4 bouts of radiation. I was to have 36.
Wow.
So so radiation Monday to Saturday, with chemo every Tuesday, and Sunday was my day off to feel sorry for myself. So that was horrific. I was very sick, lost 15 kilos within a short space of time, couldn't get out of bed at times, couldn't eat, throat closed up. So then for about 4 months I had a tube through my stomach. That's how I was feeding myself. So that was pretty hard, but and I obviously didn't do funerals or weddings for a little while. And then when I started doing funerals again, it was sort of interesting where there were people who were dying of cancer or who had died of cancer who were younger than me, and that made it a little bit hard to officiate services, for people who died of cancer. And there were photos and whatever, and it's like, well, that could have been me. So that was an interesting challenge, but I didn't really tell anybody. I just kept it to myself. And then I happened to bump into a friend of mine who's a journalist. And she said, wow, you've lost weight. How have you done that? And I said, well, actually, I've been sick. She goes, oh, anything? And I said, yeah. She said, oh, okay, well, if you want to do a story about it, let me know. And I said, oh. And a few weeks later, she rang me and said, look, she said, if you want to do a story about how you've gone through it and what have you, and you've gone out the other end, I said, well, sure. She said it might help others. So I did that. So up until then, no one really knew. And the funeral homes that I'd worked for, I said, look, I was unwell, so I'm taking a bit of time off, but didn't actually tell anybody what the problem was. So that was it. So back into it, and so I was hospitalised 3 times, and it was pretty bad. I was on drips and all that sort of stuff. But you got to fight and you get through it. So that was that. So I still have some dietary concerns. Still have to see specialists all the time. I had to see a lung specialist last week. I had to get teeth removed because my jaw went. Saliva glands are gone, so I've lost my sense of taste, smell to a degree, can't have hot foods. So there's a few of those things.
So how's that? An ongoing battle, or sort of where are you at now?
Yeah, look, it's an ongoing battle. I've put on a little bit of weight, but I'm still 12 to 14 kilos under. Lost a lot of muscle. It is what it is, survived it and stuff. So I get a little tired more than I used to, go to bed a bit earlier than I used to. Can't exercise as much as I used to, but it is what it is. So just move on.
Well, as I said, I only found this out recently. It must have been since we spoke last week, and I must have been on your website or something.
Yeah,
and came across something there. But then now to hear that your dad had passed away at the same time,
the same day. How's that? How's that for a phone call?
That tragic, to say the least. how you're coping with the loss of your dad, if you don't mind me asking.
Look, it was pretty bad. I gave the eulogy, so I choked up, and the experience I'd gained from being a celebrant didn't help me at all on the day, because it's a very different grieving process when it's someone close to you. Look, it was hard, and he was cremated and whatever, and we had a wake and that, and sort of emceed that and stuff. So, look, it was pretty hard. It is what it is. He was 89. He had a reasonably good life until the last couple of years with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, things like that. So I guess it was inevitable, but it did still happen suddenly. I mean, we weren't prepared for it. He rolled it, he fell out of bed, and that was it, gone.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but Mum's still there. She turns 90 next year. So, and we're on the phone a couple of times a week. I call her twice a week, as I always have for the last, I don't know, 50 years or whatever.
Well, look, if there's one thing that's sort of become clear as you're sharing all the different facets of your journey, is that you're a battler. You'll take on.
You got to be. Everyone should be. I mean, look, it's easy to be average, and it's easy to blame everybody else, but you got to do things. I mean, yourself. From the age of 14, I've always worked on short-term, long-term goals, and I've sort of plateaued out quite a bit now. As you get older, you do, and now I enjoy holidays. I enjoy working. I enjoy meeting people. Still go to a few functions and that. Enjoy that. I had my first game of golf last week after well over 12 months, because I didn't have the energy to walk around a golf course, to be honest. When I wasn't well, so 6 months ago, I struggled to walk 100 metres. Then I pushed it to 200. I've got a dog, so now a couple of kilometres a day I'll walk, which is fine.
Talking about short-term, long-term goals, obviously health is a priority at the moment, but where do you sort of see the tail end of your career, and any sort of goals? What's next for yourself?
No, there's not, to be honest. I enjoy what I do. I sort of feel it's part-time, and I can sort of work my own hours, although a lot of it, well, with the weddings, it's weekends, weekdays generally for a service, for funerals. I'm pretty happy. I'm pretty happy with the way things are. My children are 22 and 24, still at home. It's just fabulous they are at home. They're at university, they work part-time, and my wife and I, we've spent so much time with our kids. That's fantastic. No, look, I'm pretty happy just to go with the flow. Maybe retire in 5 years, 7 years, I don't know. But I don't know, I've seen people where they retire from work, they retire from life, so I don't want to do that. So whilst I can talk and put a couple of words together and help others, I'll just keep doing that. And I enjoy it, and make some money.
Yeah.
Got to pay for holidays somehow.
Exactly. Now, look, as we sort of bring things to a close, Mike, firstly, I just want to say thanks again for making the trek out here and spending the time, and most importantly, just being really open and vulnerable. I appreciate that about you, and it's inspiring to hear your journey, and I love that you're willing to take any opportunity by the horns and just make the most of life. And it's been great to chat to you today. Great to get to know you over the last few years, and you're a fantastic funeral celebrant, and no doubt making a lot of impact with every single family you meet.
I'm hoping to. I mean, I'm hoping to.
Thank you. Is there, before we wrap up, anything else that you wanted to share?
No, I think for young people, you've got to give things a go. And if at first it doesn't succeed, try again. It's a bit like when you ask your parents for permission. If you ask your mum and she says no, then you go to your dad. If you go to your dad, he says no, then you go to your mum. That's how life is. If someone says no, you go to the next person. And when I was young, I had to knock on doors because I didn't have talent. I didn't have anybody that I knew that could help me. So you got to give things a go. And if they don't work, my best friend, we've been best mates since we were 18, and we're still best mates. And we've both said that over the years, it's changed a little bit. We used to say, when we're 60, we want to sit in rocking chairs and have a cigar and have a scotch and don't have any regrets. Well, that's changed from 50 to 60 to 70, probably to 80, whenever. But we want to sit back and laugh at things that didn't work out, but not say, if only or what if. We don't want to do that.
Good on you. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Can't wait to keep in touch.
Thanks, Michael. Anyway, how was that for a bit of openness, eh?
Mate, I love it.